I am Bria, 29 years old, and until last month, I was the senior software engineer who built the revolutionary security system for SecurePath. My boss, Richard, fired me without warning, cruelly deleting my code repository with a sneer, "I am deleting your repo for efficiency." Little did he know that during the critical $31 million investor demonstration, my authentication system would demand a key only I possessed. The look on his face when he realized what Line 7C in my exit contract actually meant was worth every second of humiliation he put me through. Before I dive into this tech revenge story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like and subscribe button if you have ever dealt with a boss who took credit for your hard work. I grew up in Seattle, the daughter of rain and technology. From an early age, I showed an unusual aptitude for logic and problem solving. My father, a programmer for a local software company, would bring home computers for me to tinker with. While other kids were playing with dolls, I was fascinated by the way lines of code could create something out of nothing. By 12, I had built my first rudimentary program, a calculator that also told jokes when you entered certain equations. My dad laughed and said, "Bria, you might just change the world someday." High school was where I first encountered the subtle barriers for girls interested in STEM. My computer science teacher would often express surprise at my aptitude, saying things like, "Wow, you really get this stuff," as if it was unexpected. Despite the casual sexism, I excelled, winning the state programming competition my junior year. When I entered the computer science program at the University of Washington, the gender disparity became even more apparent. In a lecture hall of 150 students, only 23 were women. I quickly learned that to be taken seriously, I had to be twice as good and half as emotional. Group projects were particularly frustrating, as male teammates would often dismiss my ideas until another guy repeated them. Professor Janet Wilson became my mentor during sophomore year. She recognized my talent and encouraged me to push beyond the curriculum. "The tech world is changing," she told me, "but not fast enough. Women like you will have to kick down doors that should have been wide open already." Despite consistently ranking in the top 5% of my class, I still faced skepticism. During one memorable algorithm competition, a male competitor complained that I must have cheated when I solved a complex optimization problem faster than anyone else. The judges reviewed my work and found not only was it legitimate, but I had discovered an elegant solution they had not anticipated. Graduating with honors should have opened doors, but my first job search was disheartening. I went through 26 interviews in 3 months. Often I would make it to the final round only to be passed over for a better culture fit, which inevitably meant a guy who had less experience but played video games with the interviewer. My first position was at DataSync, a mid-sized company working on cloud storage solutions. As a junior developer, I was assigned basic bug fixes and minor feature implementations. Whenever I suggested improvements to the core architecture, my manager Tom would pat me on the shoulder and say, "Let us worry about the big picture stuff, okay?" After 18 months of being underutilized, I moved to Nexus Technologies, where I hoped to find more opportunity for growth. The pattern repeated itself, though. Despite delivering consistently excellent work, I remained stuck in support roles while less experienced male developers were promoted to lead exciting new projects. 3 years into my career, I was becoming discouraged. I had the skills and the drive, but kept hitting invisible barriers. That was when I saw the job posting for SecurePath, a promising cybersecurity startup looking for engineers to help develop next-generation authentication systems. Their mission statement about revolutionizing how we verify digital identity resonated with me immediately. The interview process was rigorous, 6 rounds including a complex coding challenge. I put everything into it, even taking a day off work to perfect my submission. 2 days after my final interview, I received the call. They were impressed with my technical skills and problem-solving approach. The salary offer was 40% more than I was making, with potential equity if the company secured major funding. On my first day at SecurePath, I met Richard Palmer, the 38-year-old CEO. With his Stanford MBA and charismatic personality, he cut an impressive figure. He shook my hand firmly and said, "Welcome aboard, Bria. We are building something revolutionary here." I quickly noticed that while Richard excelled at articulating the company vision and wooing investors, his technical knowledge was limited. He relied heavily on metaphors and buzzwords when discussing the actual product. Still, his enthusiasm was contagious, and I was eager to prove myself. My closest colleagues became Jesse in quality assurance, and Alan, a senior developer who had been with the company since its founding. Jesse was sharp-witted and observant, often catching subtleties in human dynamics before anyone else. Alan was quieter but brilliant, and unlike many senior engineers, he was generous with his knowledge and mentorship. Richard is a great frontman, Alan told me during our third week working together, but between us, the technical direction comes from the engineering team. He knows how to sell the dream, we figure out how to build it. Within my first month, I identified a fundamental flaw in the company's approach to multi-factor authentication. After working through several potential solutions, I presented a comprehensive proposal for what would eventually become KeyVault, a revolutionary authentication system that integrated biometrics, behavioral patterns, and cryptographic keys in a way that was both highly secure and user-friendly. Richard was immediately enthusiastic. "This could be our flagship product," he said during the all-hands meeting where I presented the concept. "Bria might have just secured all our futures." His praise felt validating after years of being overlooked. With Richard's approval, I threw myself into the development of KeyVault. Nights and weekends disappeared as I built the architecture from the ground up. The core innovation was in how the system handled authentication verification, creating a distributed trust model that required multiple factors of escalating security for higher-level access. What made it truly unique was how it adapted to user patterns without compromising security learning to distinguish between normal variations in behavior and potential security threats. The technical team recognized the elegance of the solution. Alan helped me refine some of the cryptographic elements while Jesse developed increasingly creative ways to test for vulnerabilities. Together, we built something that was genuinely revolutionary. As KeyVault took shape, Richard began bringing potential investors through the office. I would demonstrate the system explaining the technical innovations, only to have Richard jump in with, as I envisioned when designing the concept. The first few times I assumed he was just simplifying for non-technical audiences. Over time, I realized he was actively positioning himself as the primary creator. "That is just how these things work," Alan advised when I mentioned my concern. "The ideas always roll up to the founders in the official narrative. Focus on building something amazing and the right people will know who did the real work." I tried to accept this as part of startup culture, but it grated on me. Still, I believed in the product we were building, and Richard continued to dangle the promise of equity when we secured major funding. "You are essential to this company, Bria," he would say. "When we hit it big, you will be rewarded accordingly." 6 months into development, Richard announced exciting news. Meridian Ventures, a major venture capital firm specializing in cybersecurity investments, had expressed serious interest in a potential $31 million funding round. Everyone celebrated that night at a local bar, toasting to our bright futures. Richard pulled me aside at one point and said, "Your work on KeyVault is what caught their attention. This could be life-changing money for all of us." I felt vindicated. Finally, my work was being recognized and valued. The validation I had sought throughout my career seemed within reach. What I did not realize was that the dynamics at SecurePath were about to shift dramatically and not in my favor. 3 weeks after the announcement about Meridian Ventures' interest, Richard introduced Derek Harrison to the company as our new Chief Operating Officer. Derek and Richard had been MBA classmates at Stanford, and their easy camaraderie was immediately apparent. Derek had no technical background, having worked primarily in marketing for consumer goods companies, but Richard assured everyone that his operational expertise would help streamline our processes ahead of the important investor. Demonstrations. The company culture began to shift almost immediately. Where technical excellence had previously been our North Star, suddenly appearances and marketing language dominated conversations. Derek instituted twice-weekly alignment meetings where engineers were expected to translate their work into investor-friendly narratives. During my first presentation in this new format, I detailed some complex security improvements I had implemented in KeyVault's authentication protocols. Derek interrupted halfway through. "This is too in the weeds," he said, waving his hand dismissively. "Can you just say it is military-grade security or something investors will understand?" Actually, I replied, military grade does not really mean anything specific in security terms. What I have implemented goes beyond standard protocols in several important ways. Derek cut me off again. Let us just say it is unhackable then. Next presenter. Later, Alan pulled me aside. Welcome to the new regime, he said with a grimace. Technical accuracy is now less important than a good story. Over the next few weeks, I noticed a pattern in meetings. When I would speak, Derek would check his phone or whisper to Richard. When I raised technical concerns about proposed changes, Derek would say things like, "Let us not get bogged down in details," or, "We can address that after securing funding." More troubling was how Richard's behavior toward me changed. Where he had once sought my input and praised my innovations, he now seemed to avoid direct conversations. In the few meetings where we did interact, he would often cut me off or redirect the conversation when I began speaking about Key Vault's architecture. The final straw came when I saw a technology blog interview with Richard where he described himself as the architect and primary developer of Key Vault. There was no mention of my contributions whatsoever. When I brought the article to his attention, hoping it was an error in reporting his response, chilled me. Bria investors and the market respond to strong leadership. They need to see the CEO as the visionary behind the core technology. It is just how the game is played. He must have seen my expression because he quickly added, "You will get all the credit internally, of course. The team knows what you have done." I tried to explain that proper attribution mattered to me professionally, but Richard dismissed my concerns as being too sensitive and reminded me of the potential equity package awaiting after funding. The implicit message was clear: play along, or risk losing out on the financial reward. Meanwhile, Derek began pushing for design changes to Key Vault that would compromise its security integrity. He wanted a bypass option for premium customers that would essentially create a backdoor into the system. When I explained why this fundamentally undermined the entire security model, he accused me of being obstinate and not seeing the bigger business picture. I documented all my concerns in detailed emails, copying both Richard and our small technical team. These emails went largely unacknowledged, though Alan and Jesse privately expressed agreement with my position. The engineering team is losing influence, Jesse told me during a lunch away from the office. Have you noticed how we are being excluded from strategic discussions? Last week, there was a product roadmap meeting that neither of us was invited to. Richard barely understands how Key Vault works, I confided. Yesterday, he could not explain the authentication flow to a potential partner. I had to jump in and save the conversation. Jesse looked around to ensure we were not overheard. You should be protecting yourself, Bria. Document everything, back up your work, save important emails. Something does not feel right about the direction things are heading. Her warning struck a chord. That evening, I reviewed my employment contract and was relieved to find language about intellectual property contributions being attributed properly. I began keeping a detailed journal of my contributions to Key Vault, and all instances where proper credit was diverted. Alan, who had been through 2 previous startups, offered his perspective. I have seen this pattern before, he said gravely. As funding gets closer, founders often try to position themselves as irreplaceable while making everyone else seem interchangeable. Be careful. The following week, I discovered something that confirmed my growing suspicions. While reviewing system logs, I identified a critical security vulnerability that someone had introduced into the codebase. It was subtle, but potentially devastating if exploited. More concerning was that it appeared to have been intentionally created, not the result of a programming error. I fixed the vulnerability quietly, then traced the commit history to identify who had made the change. To my shock, it had been pushed through during a time when Richard had asked to review my code with his own credentials. When I checked other recent commits from his account, I found several instances where he had attempted to modify core authentication functions, creating potential backdoors into the system. That same day, Richard announced that Meridian Ventures had scheduled a formal demonstration of Key Vault in 6 weeks with a potential $31 million investment riding on its success. The office erupted in excitement, but my enthusiasm was tempered by what I had discovered. "This is it, team," Richard announced, champagne glass in hand. "Our moment to shine, to secure our futures. I need everyone at 110% until the demo." The preparation period was intense. Richard micromanaged every aspect of the upcoming demonstration, often making last-minute changes to presentations and workflows. He became increasingly critical of my work, questioning design decisions that had been approved months earlier and suggesting alternatives that would have weakened the system's security. One night, working late to implement some requested changes, I noticed unusual activity on our development server. Someone was attempting to access restricted parts of my code repository. I traced the IP address and discovered it came from Derek's computer. Why would the COO, who had no programming background, be trying to access the most sensitive parts of our codebase at 11:30 at night? The next morning, I implemented additional security measures to protect Key Vault's core architecture, creating a separate authentication requirement for the most critical components. I told no one about this change, documenting it only in my personal records. As the demonstration date approached, I found myself increasingly isolated. Richard scheduled planning meetings when I had other commitments, then made decisions about Key Vault's presentation without my input. Derek began referring to me as just one of our developers when introducing me to visitors. The message was becoming uncomfortably clear they were positioning to minimize my role. Despite everything, I remained committed to Key Vault's success. This was my creation, the culmination of years of expertise and months of dedicated work. Whatever games Richard and Derek were playing, I would not let it compromise the quality of what we had built. What I did not realize was how far they were willing to go to push me out of the picture entirely. 2 weeks before the scheduled demonstration for Meridian Ventures, Richard called an emergency planning meeting. The entire technical team was present, along with Derek and several members of the marketing department. Richard stood at the front of the room, uncharacteristically tense. "We need to discuss contingency plans," he announced. Meridian's technical partner, Catherine Winters, is known for trying to break systems during demonstrations. We need to be prepared for every possible scenario. This was the first I had heard about a technical partner being part of the demonstration. I raised my hand. I should review the authentication protocols again to ensure they can handle unexpected testing approaches. There are a few areas where we might need to strengthen. That is exactly the problem, Richard interrupted, his voice sharp. Everything is always so complicated with you, Bria. We need simple, foolproof solutions, not more complexity. The room fell uncomfortably silent. Richard had never spoken to me that way in front of the team before. The authentication system needs to be robust, I explained calmly. If this Catherine person is going to try to break in, we need to ensure that security is not compromised while still making the demonstration smooth. I am just suggesting we prepare properly. Derek sighed loudly. This is the paranoia we deal with constantly. Every simple request becomes a security crusade. It is not paranoia to take security seriously in a security product, I countered, feeling my face flush with a mixture of anger and embarrassment. Richard slammed his hand on the table. Enough. We are not going to waste time chasing theoretical vulnerabilities. The system works fine as it is. We need to focus on making sure the interface looks polished and the workflow is intuitive. As the meeting continued, I noticed several colleagues avoiding eye contact with me. Only Jesse and Alan showed subtle signs of support, Jesse with a sympathetic glance, and Alan with a slight nod when I made a valid point that was summarily dismissed. After the meeting, I returned to my desk feeling shaken. Something was very wrong. Richard had effectively blocked my ability to ensure Key Vault would be ready for intense scrutiny. As I reviewed recent code commits, I discovered something alarming. Richard and Derek had been attempting to reverse engineer several components of the system, specifically the parts I had most carefully protected with additional authentication requirements. Their changes showed a fundamental misunderstanding of how the security architecture worked. If implemented, they would have created massive vulnerabilities while giving the appearance of the same functionality. This was beyond concerning, it was potentially catastrophic for the product. I decided I needed to speak with Richard directly. I messaged him asking for a private meeting, which he reluctantly agreed to at the end of the day. When I entered his office, Derek was there as well, though he had not been included in my meeting request. "What is so urgent?" Bria, Richard asked, not offering me a seat. "I have found some concerning changes being attempted in the codebase," I said, opening my laptop to show the evidence I had compiled. These modifications would compromise Key Vault's core security model. I need to understand why these changes are being made without consulting me. Richard and Derek exchanged a look I could not quite interpret. Then Richard leaned forward, his expression hardening. You know this is the problem, Bria. You act as if Key Vault is your personal project rather than a company product. We need to be able to modify and adapt our offerings without running everything through you. But these specific changes break the security model, I insisted. They create backdoors that defeat the entire purpose of the system. Maybe the problem is that you have intentionally made the system too complex, Derek suggested, his tone condescending. Almost as if you wanted to make yourself indispensable. The accusation stung because it was so fundamentally wrong. I had built Key Vault with clean architecture and extensive documentation. The complexity existed because security at this level required it. That is not true, I said firmly. I have documented everything extensively. The complexity exists to ensure proper security, not to confuse anyone. Richard sighed dramatically. Look, Bria, the reality is that vision and connections are what matter in this business. Anyone can code. What we bring to the table, he gestured between himself and Derek, is the ability to see the bigger picture and get the right people in the room. His words hit me like a physical blow. Anyone can code after all the nights and weekends I had dedicated to building their flagship product. If you really believe that, then you do not understand the first thing about what makes Key Vault valuable, I said, struggling to keep my voice steady. The meeting ended with nothing resolved. I left Richard's office feeling a deep sense of foreboding. That night, I made sure to back up all my documentation and sent myself copies of my contributions via personal email, something I probably should have done much earlier. The next morning, I arrived at the office to find my security badge deactivated. When I called Jessie from the lobby, she came down looking distressed. What is happening? I asked. I do not know exactly, she whispered. Richard called an early meeting with HR before most of us arrived. They will not tell us anything. The receptionist, Sandra, who had always been friendly, looked at me apologetically. Someone from HR is coming down to meet you, Bria. Minutes later, Lisa from Human Resources appeared with a security guard. Please come with me, she said, not meeting my eyes. In a small conference room, Lisa informed me that my employment was being terminated effective immediately. The company is streamlining operations ahead of the funding round, she explained, sliding a document across the table. This outlines the terms of your separation. Before I could properly review the document, the door opened, and Richard walked in holding a flash drive. His expression was a mixture of smugness and faux regret. I will need your passwords, he said. All of them, now. Still in shock, I complied as he wrote them down. Then he opened his laptop connected to our development server and deliberately turned the screen so I could see as he navigated to my repositories. I am deleting your repo for efficiency, he sneered, as he dramatically hit the delete key on each of my project folders. We cannot have redundant and unnecessarily complicated code confusing the team. I watched in horror as months of work appeared to be erased before my eyes. What Richard did not know, what he could not have known, was that the most critical components of Key Vault were protected by additional measures I had implemented after discovering the unauthorized access attempts. Lisa pushed the termination agreement toward me again. We need you to sign this today, she said, her tone making it clear this was not negotiable. In my state of shock and distress, I skimmed the document. It seemed fairly standard, outlining a modest severance package and the usual non-disparagement clauses. I signed it, my hand shaking, slightly eager to escape the humiliating situation. As I was escorted to my desk to collect my personal belongings, I saw Alan watching from across the room, his expression grave. Jessie tried to approach but was intercepted by Derek. Other colleagues kept their heads down, suddenly fascinated by their monitors. Sandra handed me a box for my things as I cleared my desk of the few personal items I kept there. A family photo, a ceramic mug my niece had made a small plant. This is not right, she whispered. I am sorry. The security guard stood impassively beside me as if I might attempt to steal company property or cause a scene. The walk to the elevator with my small box of belongings was one of the longest of my life. As the doors closed, I caught a final glimpse of the office where I had poured my heart and soul into building something I believed in. In the parking garage, I sat in my car for nearly 20 minutes, too numb to drive. My phone buzzed with a text from Jesse. "This is not right. Call you later." On the drive home, questions and doubts flooded my mind. Had I been difficult to work with? Was I too protective of my code? Should I have been more political, less focused on technical integrity? The questions gave way to a deep sense of loss. Key Vault had been more than just a project to me. It represented everything I had worked toward in my career. That night I barely slept. I lost my appetite and spent hours staring at the ceiling, replaying every interaction with Richard and Derek, wondering where things had gone so wrong. The final insult came the next morning when I saw the company-wide email Richard had sent, which a sympathetic colleague forwarded to me. "As we prepare for this critical phase in our company's growth, we have made the difficult but necessary decision to streamline inefficient resources. We are confident that these changes will position SecurePath for success in our upcoming investor demonstrations. The simplified development structure will allow us to be more agile and responsive to market needs." The message was clear. I had been labeled as inefficient and an obstacle to success. After everything I had contributed, this was how my story at SecurePath ended, or so I thought at the time. The weeks following my termination from SecurePath were some of the darkest of my professional life. I cycled through anger, humiliation, self-doubt, and a profound sense of injustice. Some days I could barely find the motivation to get out of bed, let alone open my laptop, and face the world of code that had once been my passion. My family tried to be supportive, but they did not fully understand the technical aspects of what had happened. "You will find another job," my mother assured me during our weekly call. "You are so smart and capable." She was right, of course. With my skills and experience, I could find another position, but that wasn't the point. Key Vault had been my creation, the product of countless hours of innovation and problem-solving. Having it taken away and watching Richard position himself as its creator felt like a violation I could not easily move past. About a week after my firing, Jessie called from an unknown number during her lunch break. "Things are a mess," she reported in a hushed voice. "No one can fully access or modify the core functions of Key Vault. Richard brought in some hotshot consultant who keeps hitting authentication barriers." Despite everything, I felt a twinge of satisfaction. The security measures I had implemented were working exactly as designed. "What is Richard saying?" I asked. "He is trying to play it cool, but he is panicking. The demo is less than 2 weeks away, and they cannot even access the admin console without triggering security protocols. Derek suggested they rebuild the interface from scratch, but everyone knows that is impossible in the time frame." Jessie continued to provide clandestine updates over the following days. Richard had apparently hired 3 expensive security consultants, none of whom could bypass the authentication requirements I had built into the system. The company was in crisis mode, with everyone working overtime to find a solution before the Meridian Ventures demonstration. Catherine Winters from Meridian has requested the full technical documentation ahead of the demo, Jessie told me during one call. "Richard is freaking out because what they have is incomplete without your architecture notes." I was still processing this information when I received an unexpected call from a number I did not recognize. The woman on the other end introduced herself as Elizabeth Walker, external legal counsel for SecurePath. "I was hoping we might meet informally to discuss some loose ends regarding your departure," she said, her tone carefully neutral. "There seems to be some confusion about certain aspects of the intellectual property transition." We arranged to meet at a coffee shop equidistant from both our offices. Elizabeth turned out to be a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s, direct, but not unfriendly in her manner. "I will be straightforward, Miss Walker," she said after we had settled with our drinks. "There is an issue with line 7C in your exit contract." "What issue?" I asked, trying to recall the details of the document I had signed while in an emotional state. Elizabeth slid a copy of my termination agreement across the table, a section highlighted in yellow. "This clause pertains to the transfer of intellectual property rights and authentication protocols." I read the highlighted section carefully, my heart beginning to race as I understood its implications. According to line 7C, while SecurePath retained ownership of the Key Vault code and concept certain authentication keys and security implementations, remained my intellectual property unless specifically transferred through a separate agreement which had never been executed. In simple terms, they owned the house, but I still held the only keys. This was frankly an oversight on our part, Elizabeth admitted. Standard contracts usually include comprehensive IP transfer provisions. This one was incomplete. So what exactly are you saying? I asked, though I was beginning to see the picture clearly. SecurePath needs your assistance for the investor demonstration, she said plainly. Without the proper authentication keys and your expertise on the security architecture, they cannot properly showcase KeyVault's capabilities. I took a long sip of my coffee, buying time to process this remarkable reversal of fortune. I see. And Richard sent you to request my help. Richard did not send me, Elizabeth clarified. The board did. They became aware of the situation yesterday and asked me to evaluate the legal position. My recommendation was to approach you directly. With newfound attention to detail, I read through my entire contract again there at the table. Elizabeth waited patiently as I examined every clause and subsection. The language was clear in his haste to remove me. Richard had failed to secure proper knowledge transfer of the authentication systems I had designed. What exactly would helping entail? I asked finally. At minimum, providing the authentication keys and documentation needed for the demonstration. Ideally, your presence during preparation to ensure everything functions correctly. Elizabeth hesitated before adding, "The board is prepared to discuss fair compensation for your assistance." I thanked Elizabeth for the information and promised to consider the request, saying I would need to consult with my own legal representation first. As we parted, she handed me her card. "Whatever your decision, I recommend resolving this promptly. The demonstration is in 10 days. That evening, I researched Meridian Ventures, thoroughly focusing particularly on Catherine Winters, the technical partner who would be evaluating KeyVault. Her background was impressive. A former security engineer for the financial sector who had transitioned to venture capital with a reputation for rigorous technical due diligence. She was known for asking penetrating questions and testing systems personally during demonstrations. I also reviewed my own documentation and backups of KeyVault's architecture, confirming that without my specific implementation knowledge, they would indeed struggle to showcase the system's full capabilities. The next day brought a flurry of increasingly desperate messages from Richard. His first voicemail maintained a facade of casualness. "Bria, hope you are doing well. There are some technical questions that have come up that you might be able to help clarify. Give me a call when you have a chance." By his third message, the pretense had fallen away. This is becoming a serious issue. The team needs access to those authentication protocols immediately. This is about the future of the company. His final text message that evening was the most revealing. "Whatever you want, name your price." In that moment, I realized the full extent of my leverage. Richard had underestimated me, assumed I was just another replaceable engineer. Now he was discovering just how wrong he had been. The morning after receiving Richard's desperate text, I contacted Timothy Jackson, an attorney specializing in technology and intellectual property law. His office was in a modest building away from the flashy downtown firms, which somehow made me trust him more. "They need you more than you need them," Timothy said after reviewing my contracts and the situation. "That is a rare position of power in employment disputes. Let us make sure we use it wisely." Over the next 2 hours, Timothy helped me understand my legal position. The contract language was clear. I retained rights to certain authentication keys and security implementation details. SecurePath owned the overall product, but without my specific knowledge, they could not fully demonstrate or modify key aspects of the system. "What do you want out of this?" Timothy asked, leaning back in his chair. "Money recognition. A new position." I considered the question carefully. All of the above, to be honest. I want proper credit for my work, fair compensation for what I created, and some form of ongoing involvement to ensure the technical integrity of KeyVault. Timothy nodded approvingly. "Those are reasonable requests given your contributions. Let us draft a response that outlines your conditions clearly." As we worked on the response, Jessie called with more intelligence from inside SecurePath. "They have tried everything short of completely rebuilding the system," she reported. The consultants said it would take weeks to reverse engineer the authentication protocols, and even then they might miss critical security elements. "How is Richard handling it?" I asked. "Not well," Jesse said, with a hint of satisfaction. He is blaming everyone but himself. Yesterday, he yelled at the engineering team for allowing the system to become too dependent on a single developer. Alan finally stood up and said, "We told you Bria was essential to this project months ago." That afternoon, with Timothy's guidance, I sent a measured response to Richard. I am willing to discuss how I might assist with the upcoming demonstration. My conditions include proper attribution for my role in developing Key Vault fair compensation, reflecting industry standards for founding engineers, and an advisory position to ensure the system's ongoing integrity. I am available to meet with the board to discuss terms. Richard's response came within minutes. "Fine, whatever, just come fix this." Timothy advised me to ignore this message and deal only with Elizabeth Walker or board members directly going forward. Richard has demonstrated he is not negotiating in good faith, he explained. We need to work with decision-makers who understand the value you bring. Over the next few days, I prepared thoroughly for whatever might come next. I researched standard industry compensation for founding engineers in successful startups, finding that equity packages of 3 to 5% were common, along with technical advisory board positions. I also practiced explaining Key Vault's architecture in clear, accessible terms that would showcase its sophistication without unnecessary technical jargon. If I was going to be in the room with Meridian Ventures, I needed to demonstrate not just technical expertise but business acumen as well. Catherine Winters is known for asking targeted questions about security architecture, I told Jesse during one of our strategy sessions. I need to be prepared to explain not just how Key Vault works, but why specific design choices were made. From what I have heard, she has a background similar to yours, Jesse replied. She will recognize quality work when she sees it. The day before the scheduled demonstration, I received a formal email from Elizabeth Walker outlining proposed terms for my assistance, a consulting fee, a non-disclosure agreement, and attribution as a significant contributor to Key Vault. The offer was insultingly inadequate given my role as the primary architect of the entire system. With Timothy's help, I crafted a counter-offer proper credit as Key Vault's principal architect, fair compensation, including an equity position, reflecting my founding contribution, and a technical advisory board role with authority over security implementations. I made it clear that these were my minimum conditions for providing the authentication keys and supporting the demonstration. That evening, Richard called in a final desperate attempt to circumvent the formal negotiations. "Look, we can figure out the details after the demo," he said, his voice strained. "Just give us the access we need, and I promise we will make it right." "I need the agreement in writing before I provide any assistance," I replied calmly. "My terms are reasonable given my contributions to Key Vault." "Fine," he snapped. "In principle, I agree to your terms contingent on a successful demonstration. Elizabeth will send the paperwork in the morning." After hanging up, I carefully prepared everything needed for the next day. The authentication keys stored on a secure device, comprehensive documentation of the system architecture, and a professional outfit that would convey confidence. Without trying too hard, I chose a structured blazer over the Secure Path Company hoodie. I still had a small but meaningful statement about my continuing connection to the product I had built. That night, for the first time since my termination, I slept soundly. The anxiety that had plagued me for weeks had transformed into a calm confidence. I was no longer a victim of corporate politics, but a skilled professional with unique value and leverage. Jessie called early the next morning. "Just wanted to wish you luck," she said. "Though from what I am seeing, luck has nothing to do with it. You prepared for this moment even when you did not know it was coming." "Thanks for being my eyes and ears," I replied. "Are you going to be there today?" "Absolutely." Richard tried to limit attendance to essential personnel only, but I pointed out that as QA lead, I needed to document any technical issues that arise during the demonstration. "I will be your ally in the room." As I drove to the Secure Path headquarters, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this moment. The hurt and betrayal were still there, but they had been joined by a sense of validation and emerging strength. Whatever happened next, I had already proven to myself that I would not be erased from my own creation. I arrived at Secure Path headquarters 30 minutes before the scheduled demonstration, my heart pounding as I approached the familiar glass doors. The security guard at the front desk did a double take when he saw me. "Miss Walker, I thought you no longer worked here." "I have been invited back for the investor demonstration," I explained, showing him the email from Elizabeth. As he called to verify my clearance, Sandra, the receptionist, spotted me from her desk and hurried over, her face lighting up with surprise. "Bria, I cannot believe it. Are you coming back?" she asked hopefully. "Just for today," I said, returning her warm smile. "Special request from the board." Sandra leaned closer and whispered, "It has been chaos since you left. Nobody understands how anything works." The security guard returned with a temporary badge. "You are cleared to go up, Miss Walker. The demonstration is in the main conference room." As I stepped off the elevator onto the main floor, the reactions from my former colleagues were a study in contrasts. Some approached with genuine warmth, others averted their gaze awkwardly. Alan gave me a subtle thumbs up from his desk, while several engineers I had worked closely with came over to shake my hand. "Thank God you are here," whispered Taylor, a junior developer. "We have been running in circles trying to prepare for today." Jessie appeared at my side, looking professional in a blazer I had never seen her wear before. "Ready for this?" she asked, squeezing my arm supportively. "As ready as I will ever be," I replied. We walked toward the main conference room, where I could see through the glass walls that several people in business attire were already seated around the large table. Richard was at the front of the room, gesturing animatedly as he spoke to a distinguished-looking woman in her 50s. The moment Richard spotted me through the glass, his animated expression froze, then darkened. He excused himself from his conversation and met me at the door, his smile tight and artificial. "Bria, glad you could make it," he said through clenched teeth. "Do you have everything we discussed?" I patted my laptop bag. "All ready to go, Richard," as agreed. Elizabeth Walker approached, extending her hand professionally. "Miss Walker, thank you for coming on such short notice. I have the agreement we discussed ready for your review." Richard looked between us with barely concealed irritation. "Let us handle the paperwork after the demonstration, shall we? Meridian is eager to see the system in action." "Actually," Elizabeth interjected smoothly, "the board was quite clear that the agreement should be executed prior to the demonstration." Richard's jaw tightened, but he nodded curtly and stepped aside so Elizabeth could lead me to a small side office. There, I reviewed the document carefully with Jessie as my witness. The terms matched what we had negotiated: recognition as KeyVault's principal architect, an equity position, and a technical advisory role with authority over security implementations. Once I had signed and received my copy, Elizabeth led us back to the main conference room, where the tension was palpable. Derek stood near Richard, whispering urgently in his ear and shooting nervous glances my way. Elizabeth guided me to the front of the room. "Allow me to introduce Bria Walker, KeyVault's principal architect, who has joined us today as a technical advisor." The distinguished woman I had seen earlier extended her hand. "Catherine Winters, technical partner at Meridian Ventures. I have been looking forward to meeting the mind behind this system." Richard quickly interjected. As I was explaining, Catherine KeyVault was developed under my technical direction, with Bria handling some of the coding implementation. Catherine raised an eyebrow slightly but said nothing, as Richard moved swiftly into his prepared presentation. The room was filled with SecurePath staff and 5 representatives from Meridian Ventures, including James Pearson, their lead investor. Richard's opening presentation was polished, if technically vague, emphasizing market opportunity and potential growth rather than technical specifics. When Catherine began asking detailed questions about the security architecture, Richard's responses became increasingly general. "The proprietary authentication system uses cutting-edge algorithms to ensure absolute security," he stated confidently. "Could you elaborate on the specific approach to multi-factor verification?" Catherine pressed, "particularly how you handle the balance between security and user experience." Richard glanced at me briefly, then launched into a response that demonstrated his fundamental misunderstanding of how KeyVault actually worked. I maintained a neutral expression, though it took considerable effort. "I think we should move to the live demonstration," James Pearson suggested after several minutes of this. "I am eager to see the system in action." Richard nodded eagerly. "Absolutely. We have prepared a comprehensive demonstration of KeyVault's capabilities." He turned to the large display screen at the front of the room and launched the demonstration environment. The familiar key vault interface appeared sleek and professional. Richard began to navigate through the initial screens, explaining features with renewed confidence. Then he reached the administrator authentication page, and the screen displayed a simple message: awaiting authentication. Richard's fingers hesitated over the keyboard. He tried entering what I assumed was the standard admin password, but the system responded, primary authentication accepted, awaiting secondary security key. He tried again with a different combination. The message remained unchanged. James Pearson leaned forward, his interest clearly piqued. Is there a problem? Not at all, Richard said, though his forehead had begun to glisten with perspiration. Just a routine security protocol. He tried a third combination without success. Who has the authentication key? James asked directly. Richard froze his mouth, opening and closing without producing sound. Beside him, Derek looked equally panicked. Elizabeth, who had been observing quietly from the side, approached Richard and discreetly showed him a document pointing to a specific section. I could not hear her exact words, but I clearly saw her mouth. Did you read line 7C? Oh no. The room had fallen uncomfortably silent. All eyes moved from Richard's frozen expression to me. Catherine Winters broke the silence. Perhaps the principal architect could assist with the demonstration. I stood up calmly and walked to the front of the room. I would be happy to help, I said, my voice steady, despite my racing heart. As I took position at the keyboard, I addressed the room professionally. Key Vault's security architecture is built on a multi-layered authentication model that adapts to user behavior patterns while maintaining rigorous security protocols. I inserted the secure device containing my authentication key and began typing. The screen transformed, revealing the full administrative console. The system you are seeing employs a distributed trust model, I explained, navigating through various security settings. What makes it unique is how it balances seemingly contradictory needs absolute security with intuitive user experience. For the next 20 minutes, I demonstrated Key Vault's capabilities, explaining the technical innovations in terms accessible to both business and technical audiences. Catherine asked increasingly specific questions, which I answered with confidence and precision. The most revolutionary aspect, I explained, is how the system adapts to user behavior patterns without compromising security thresholds. It can distinguish between normal variations in behavior and potential security threats. I could see Catherine's growing appreciation for the technical elegance of the solution. James Pearson and the other investors were equally engaged, asking insightful questions about implementation and scalability. Richard made several attempts to reassert control of the presentation, stepping forward with comments like, "As I envisioned when planning the system architecture." Each time, Catherine would direct her follow-up questions specifically to me, effectively sidelining Richard's attempts to claim credit. When the technical demonstration concluded, James Pearson sat back with a satisfied expression. Impressive. Truly impressive. Catherine turned to me directly. I have one more question, Miss Walker. Given your obvious central role in developing this technology, what is your ongoing involvement with SecurePath and Key Vault's future development? Before Richard could interject, I responded confidently. As of this morning, I have formalized an agreement to serve as technical advisor to the board with specific oversight of Key Vault's security architecture. I am committed to ensuring the system maintains its integrity while evolving to meet emerging security challenges. Catherine nodded approvingly while Richard struggled to maintain his professional facade. The message was clear: the success of the demonstration had been entirely dependent on my expertise, and everyone in the room knew it. As the meeting concluded, and the investors prepared to leave, James Pearson approached me directly. We should talk more about your vision for Key Vault's future development. Catherine rarely gets excited about new technologies, but she is clearly impressed with your work. Richard hovered nearby, attempting to insert himself into the conversation, but James politely but firmly focused on me. Perhaps we could arrange a separate technical discussion next week. I agreed, exchanging contact information while acutely aware of Richard's barely contained frustration. The power dynamic had shifted irreversibly, and we both knew it. After the Meridian Ventures team departed, Elizabeth invited me to join a private meeting with the company's board members who had observed the demonstration remotely. In a conference room away from Richard's oversight, the atmosphere was notably different, much more respectful and appreciative of my contributions. "The demonstration exceeded our expectations," said Robert Chen, the board chairman. "It is clear that your expertise was instrumental in developing Key Vault. We should have had a better understanding of your role earlier," added Diane Mitchell, another board member. "There seems to have been a significant communication gap regarding the attribution of technical developments." The implied criticism of Richard's leadership hung in the air unspoken. Catherine Winters had joined this meeting as well, and she offered her professional assessment without reservation. "What you have built is genuinely innovative. The security architecture shows a sophisticated understanding of both technical requirements and human factors in authentication systems." She then leaned toward me, speaking woman to woman. A word of advice from someone who has been in male-dominated tech environments for decades. Never undervalue your contributions or allow others to minimize them. Your equity position should reflect your founding role in developing the company's primary technology. The board members exchanged glances and Robert nodded. "We are prepared to revise the terms of your advisory role to include expanded equity and voting rights on technical decisions." The negotiation that followed was unlike anything I had previously experienced. Instead of fighting for recognition, I found myself in a position of strength with Catherine, occasionally offering subtle guidance on standard terms for technical founders. By the end of the meeting, we had established terms that properly valued my contributions: a 5% equity stake, a seat on the technical advisory board with veto power over security-related decisions, and proper attribution as Key Vault's principal architect in all company materials and presentations. When we emerged from the conference room, Richard was waiting, attempting to appear casual despite his obvious anxiety. Robert took him aside for what appeared to be a serious conversation while I gathered my things to leave. Derek approached me with an unconvincing smile. "No hard feelings, right? Business is business." "Yes, it is," I agreed coolly, "and I am very good at my business." Over the next few weeks, significant changes unfolded at SecurePath. The board initiated a restructuring of the technical leadership, creating a new Chief Technology Officer position that reported directly to them rather than to Richard. Several colleagues who had previously been hesitant to approach me sent messages of support and congratulations. Derek departed the company abruptly after Meridian's due diligence team raised questions about his qualifications and contributions. In the revised company narrative, my role as Key Vault's creator was prominently featured, much to Richard's barely disguised displeasure. While I maintained my advisory position at SecurePath, I decided against returning to full-time employment there. The experience had shown me both my value and the importance of working in an environment that respected technical expertise. With my new financial security from the equity arrangement, I began planning my own venture focused on ethical security solutions. Jessie was the first to join me in this new endeavor. "I've seen how you work and what you value," she said when I offered her the role of Quality Assurance Director. "Those are things worth building a company around." The healing process was not immediate. For months, I experienced moments of anger when remembering Richard's dismissive treatment and attempted erasure of my contributions. Working through these emotions taught me valuable lessons about self-advocacy and professional boundaries. One unexpected outcome was a growing friendship with Elizabeth Walker. "I admired how you handled yourself during the entire situation," she told me over coffee months later. "You were professional, even when others were not, and you stood firm on your value without becoming vindictive." Perhaps the most gratifying development came 6 months after the demonstration, when I was invited to speak at a Women in Tech conference about my experience. Standing before a room of female engineers and entrepreneurs, I shared not just the technical aspects of Key Vault, but the more difficult lessons about navigating credit and recognition in technology environments. Document everything, I advised the audience. Read every contract carefully. And most importantly, know your worth and be prepared to advocate for it professionally, but firmly. The response was overwhelming. Dozens of women approached me afterward with similar stories and questions about how to protect their intellectual contributions. I realized that my experience, painful as it had been, could serve as a valuable lesson for others facing similar situations. SecurePath eventually secured the full funding from Meridian Ventures, with KeyVault becoming a market-leading authentication solution. As technical advisor, I ensured that security and integrity remained central to the product's development, even as new features were added. Catherine Winters became something of a mentor to me, offering guidance as I developed my own company. When I was ready for initial funding, she was the first to invest, citing her belief in both the technology and my leadership. In my final meeting with Richard before transitioning fully to my new venture, I found him noticeably changed. The experience had humbled him, at least temporarily. "I underestimated you," he admitted reluctantly, "and I misunderstood what made KeyVault valuable." "The technology or me?" I asked. "Both," he conceded. "I still think the business side matters, but I was wrong about technical expertise being interchangeable." It was not exactly an apology, but it was an acknowledgement I had not expected to receive. As I left his office for the last time, I felt the final pieces of resentment beginning to dissolve, replaced by a forward-looking focus on creating technology with integrity and building a company culture that genuinely valued expertise. Today, 2 years later, my security firm employs 15 people, including several women engineers I have specifically mentored. We prioritize ethical applications of security technology and transparent attribution of contributions. Every team member's innovations are properly credited both internally and in our external communications. Looking back, I can see that what seemed like the worst moment of my career actually launched me towards something better. By standing up for my work and worth, I found my voice, not just as an engineer, but as a leader. If you have ever had your contributions minimized or faced similar challenges in your career, I hope my story gives you courage. Never let anyone delete your achievements or erase your part in creating something valuable. Document your work, know your rights, and remember that technical excellence speaks for itself when given the opportunity. Have you ever had to stand up for your work or contributions? Share your experiences in the comments below. And if this story resonated with you, please like, subscribe, and share it with others who might need to hear that they too can overcome professional setbacks and emerge stronger. Thank you for listening to my journey, and remember, your value is not determined by others' recognition, but by the quality and integrity of your work.